There you go.
Here's Joseph.
Hi. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Okay, we are now live on YouTube.
Lovely. Thank you, Ian. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fifth of six of our sessions in the season of creation in our speaker series. And we've had quite success so far, and we're hoping for the same with our discussion tonight with Roberto. And so my name is Mary Wooding, and I will be moderating this evening's session. I think I'm going to go initially this evening because today is such a poignant and important day as the first National Truth and Reconciliation Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So I'm going to go to the land acknowledgement. And I'm going to say that over the last several days, I have participated in many events. And over the last several years, I've participated in many events, but they are just so incredibly moving and meaningful. And I have been sharing with the people that I know that I don't think are sort of tapped in, and I hope you will do the same. So we'll acknowledge this evening that we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat, as well as the other peoples, nations who have sought to walk gently on this land. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one rooted and based on honor and deep respect. And in the calls to action from the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I think the action part is what we're called to do. So I really pray that we will move on that action going forward. Thank you. And I will turn it over to Ian Ritchie to do our opening prayer.
The Lord be with you.
And also,
Also with you.
Gracious God, Heavenly Father, we give thanks and praise to you, Creator and Maker and Friend. We pray that you will bless and bring reconciliation. We pray that you will enable those who did not go through the experience of the residential schools to be able to hear the stories of those who did. And we pray that this evening, as we hear more of your word about the work of your kingdom of tending God's garden, that our hearts and minds will be focused on you so that your reign is extended in this world. For we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
amen. Thank you, Ian. So the sessions that we've been working on, have been organized by the Green Group, to the Diocese of Ontario. And the Diocese Green Group's purpose and the mission statement is the promotion of the fifth mark of mission. So welcome everybody this evening. So I'm going to jump right into my introduction of Roberto, who's on our screen here. So Roberto Chiotti is a Toronto-based architect and founding partner of Larkin Architect Limited, an award-winning firm specializing in the design of sacred space, which obviously he will be talking about this evening. In addition to his professional architectural training, Roberto has a Master of Theology Studies from the University of St. Michael's College, University of Toronto, with a specialty in theology and ecology granted by the Elliott Allen Institute. He is LEED certified, leadership in energy and environmental design professional, and has been invested in the RAIC College of Fellows and is a member of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. So having completed over 100 building projects for parishes in Southern Ontario, Roberto has developed significant expertise in heritage restoration and rehabilitation. Liturgical design, facilitating the design process for sacred space, and the integration of sustainable design principles for sacred spaces. He's currently serves on the Bishop's Committee for Creation Care in the Diocese of Toronto and its liturgy and education subcommittees. So this evening, I'm going to just turn it over directly to Roberto. And the floor is yours, Roberto. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. I too would like to begin with land acknowledgement. And forgive me if I read some of it because I'm in Toronto and it's a long one. So I want to acknowledge that I'm living on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also want to recognize that that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Okay, so, and what I'm going to do, I do want to acknowledge that the reason why I'm here is because of Sylvia Keesmaat, who is also a member of the Bishop's Care for Creation Committee, one of the co-chairs, and it's through her friendship with Mary and Dawn that I was introduced and invited to participate in this wonderful series. So I just wanted to start with that. And I'm going to open up and I share my screen. Oops.
I would just say that if everybody could mute themselves, that would be helpful.
Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, and let me go back, sorry. All right, so the topic of this evening's presentation is climate change, because I think that's, you know, probably the biggest existential challenge that we all face as a human community. And then I'm going to say, because my background is in eco-theology, I want to spend a little bit of time sharing what I think the eco-theology can bring to addressing the issues of climate change. Now, you have to forgive me, I only have a few minutes and it represents probably close to 10 years of study. So forgive me if I leave out a few details. So here we go. I'm going to start with that introduction to eco-theology and how it can contribute to towards addressing the climate change challenges that we face. And but I also, because I'm also a heritage professional, I want to talk a little bit about the role of churches as iconic social cultural heritage landmarks. I'm sure that everyone in the diocese who attends church is very much connected with their beloved church facilities. But I also want to acknowledge that even for the unchurched or those who maybe worship in other churches, particularly in rural environments, the churches represent within the collective consciousness of the community, major landmarks. And they speak almost to the identity of the community because of their heritage, their significance, the fact that they've been there for so long. And then I want to share some approaches and resources for making churches more sustainable. I'm going to avoid a checklist because there are lots of checklists out there, but what I want to do is kind of point you in the direction of a number of resources that hopefully you can follow up with. So when I went to study theology, one of the foundational courses was something called Foundations of Theology. And one of the first things the professor shared was that revelation comes to us in two ways. The one we're most familiar with is through the Word of God or sacred scriptures. That goes without saying. But the second way is through God's creation. And so eco-theology, which has emerged in the last probably 2 to 3 decades, really, because when I was studying in the 1990s, it was a very emerging kind of part of theology, and there wasn't a whole lot written about it. But now you'll find, if you kind of Google eco-theology, you'll find lots and lots of writing about it, including a lot of my classmates who went on to become theologians. So eco-theology reclaims that part of our Christian tradition that looks to God's creation as the primary revelatory experience of the divine. Or if you're uncomfortable with the primary, I would say at least a primary revelatory experience of the divine. I think our tradition has tended to focus on scripture for hundreds of years, and we have we have lost our understanding of creation as also a revelatory of the divine. So our biblical cosmology, which we're all familiar with, when we look at the Genesis story and passages that describe dominion over creation, that it accepted human exceptionalism as an a priori value. In other words, humans, sorry, maybe I want to go back for a minute, because humans were made in the image of God, we had souls, and we were the most important species on the planet. We were created on basically the last working day of creation, and everything else, because it didn't have a soul, didn't matter, or it was really only understood to be for its instrumental value for human beings to be used. And the modern pervasive Western worldview, which has really got us into this crisis that we find ourselves in, has evolved to see the Earth's resources strictly as commodities to serve the needs of humans. So basically what we have is dysfunctional modes of production and consumption that drive world economics. It's based on, extracting resources from the earth, using a whole lot of energy to make it into stuff that we use. And then when we're finished with that stuff, we throw it into a landfill. And we expect the earth, the soil, the air, and the water to absorb all of our, waste material. In fact, if you look at any corporation's economic statements or business models, all those things I'm talking about are really considered as externalities, meaning they're not part of the economic equation. And yet the reality is we're building up a huge, if you will, a huge deficit with the earth because we've ignored all of that. So the bottom line is that this story is dysfunctional and threatens all planetary life. In other words, we cannot, if we continue to relate to the earth and to each other in the way we have for the last 300 or 400 years, life as we know it will not be possible. So what I studied, theologians like Tom Berry, he basically said what we need is a new story that embraces the earth as a sacred reality. We need to define a cosmology or worldview based upon an ecocentric understanding of the earth as primary and the human as derivative. For the last several hundred years, we've been acting as though our needs are primary and those of the earth are derivative. And yet it's impossible to imagine a healthy human community on an unhealthy planet. And yet we keep assuming that to be the case. So ultimately what that means is that we need to appreciate all living and non-living entities for their intrinsic value and not just for their instrumental value of how they can be used to benefit humankind. Whether it's the mountains, the streams, the forest, the animals, the birds, everything has its own intrinsic value as part of the ecosystem that serves as our home, planet home, and each one deserves our respect and their individual rights to succeed as a species, because we all know that the health of an ecosystem depends on the ability of all its constituent parts to thrive. So recently, we all know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was issued, I think it was in July or August, provides a sobering projection of the effects of climate change, which is a real and imminent threat to life on Earth as we know it. So time is of the essence. I believe, I mean, depending on who you listen to, we have at the very most a decade to turn the ship around before the impact of global warming will have, significantly catastrophic effects on many, many, many parts of this world. So when it comes to architecture or buildings or our churches, the bad news is that buildings contribute as much as 55% of all greenhouse gas emissions within urban centers like the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, and 40% globally. And that's in their production and like creating all the materials that go into our buildings, the actual erection and construction of the buildings, the transportation of those materials, and the ongoing operations. Okay. The not bad news is that the building industry has the technology and expertise to create net zero emission buildings today. Unlike, say, the oil industry or even transportation industry, we actually have the technology and the expertise to turn our profession and our industry around. And yet, currently, even though there's incredible amount of conversation in this regard from a number of different areas of the industry, there hasn't been enough will to turn it around today. And the latest news is that even if every new building were to be net zero operationally, we will not be able to build our way out of the climate crisis. In other words, every building that already exists has a certain amount of embodied carbon in it by virtue of the fact that materials were used to create it, and it exists today. So we're beginning to finally understand that those existing buildings are critical, and we need to keep them. We need not to tear them down and put them into landfill. So the point being that the most sustainable buildings we have are actually those that we already exist, which may be counterintuitive to what you're experiencing or hearing about your own, say, old churches that maybe don't have any insulation in them. There may be old mass wall buildings, and the cost to heat them every month in the winter months is prohibitive. And yet, in the big picture, they're still incredibly sustainable, and there are things that you can do to make them even more sustainable. So, for example, if you were to consider tearing down your old church that might be 50 years old or 100 years old or somewhere in between, and replace it with the most sustainable new building that you could possibly build using the latest technologies, even if it's net zero, it will actually take decades to offset the embodied energy in that new building compared to the existing building that it replaces. Now, maybe that's not so intuitively understood. So the point being that if interventions to a church building or its property are being considered, then there is an existential, theological, moral, and practical imperative to do the right thing. I'm not sure in the Ontario diocese, how much, what the state is of your current church properties is like, and whether or not there is the appetite to renovate them or expand them or to merge parishes and build new facilities. So what I'm saying tonight, I'm trying to keep as kind of a big picture, 30,000 feet kind of look, so that you can take these basic principles and apply them to any project at any scale, if you will. So you may be familiar with the papal encyclical that came out in 2015 called Laudato Si on care for our common home. It turned out that it was promulgated at exactly the same time that I was co-chairing a conference at OCAD University that I co-organized on urban ecologies. And even though the audience and the participants were like 99% secular, they were absolutely extremely excited that a religious leader would come out with that type of document that supported the science and what they were doing to try to mitigate climate change and transform the way we build and understand how cities work. So what I'm saying or suggesting, and this is certainly part of that encyclical, is that what we need is an ecological conversion, a metanoia. So that a metanoia is a Greek word to describe a transformative change of heart and spirit that embraces economics, social justice, and ecology as part of the same indivisible conversation. Even in my own industry, we've tended to look at sustainability, sometimes in relationship to economics, but not often when it comes to things like social justice. So, anyway, so I think this is really important. I think all the things we're talking about tonight are, they have intersectionalities with everything from what is poignant about today, about truth and reconciliation, and how indigenous peoples who have lived and tended to Turtle Island for millennia have related to their land. And we can learn a lot from them as to how we as settlers should be relating to the land. Here's another voice, Dieter Hessel, who's a theologian. And he says that eco-justice occurs wherever human beings receive enough sustenance and build enough community to love harmoniously with God, to achieve equity among humans, and to appreciate the rest of creation for its own sake. And again, with my emphasis in parentheses, intrinsic value and not simply as useful to humans, that is the instrumental value. And then from my own mentor, Thomas Berry, in his very famous book, The Dream of the Earth, he says that the ecological age, which we really need to facilitate the emergence of the ecological age, fosters the deep awareness of the sacred presence within each reality of the universe. So whether it's a solar system, an atom, a person, or a frog, we're all part of the sacred reality that is the universe. And only such a comprehensive vision can produce commitment required to stop the world of exploitation, of manipulation, of violence so intense that it threatens to destroy not only the human city, but also the planet itself. So for me, part of the pathos for me is the fact that our pervasive presence on the planet as humans and our actions, it's not just that we're destroying our home for us, but we're destroying it for all other life forms. And I think that's the bigger tragedy for me, because they don't have a voice. So what does this mean? Like, first things first, so how do we proceed? I think it's absolutely essential that we cultivate it and be animated by a sense of collective purpose. We're all in this together, and that shared purpose needs to recognize that we all belong to something greater than ourselves. Our culture tends to be, and we see this particularly south of the border, in the polarities and the politicization of things like vaccines and individual rights, and seems that we have focused on the individual to the detriment of the greater good or the collective. So we need an overarching intentionality, internally driven from the heart and the soul, that will serve to navigate the process and its stressors for how to bring about a more mutually enhancing relationship between humans and the earth. There has to be a why. Why are we doing this? Is it selfishly to protect us and our kids, or is it really that we see the whole as an integrated, subjective reality, sacred reality that needs to move forward into the future as a single family? So ultimately, for me, it comes down to reestablishing right relationship with God, who is the great creator. The great gift of creation comes from God. To self, to honor self, and to really examine our own wants versus our needs. To care for others, all others, and the planet in all of its integral functioning. So not just all the things that are on the planet, but the actual systems that allow the planet to function, in a way that supports life. So the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the soil, all of this needs to be properly cared for. So Thomas Berry would say the dream drives the action. In fact, he wrote a book called The Dream of the Earth, where he really feels that as humans, we can't solve this on our own. We really need to embrace what he calls the dream of the earth and integrate that if we're attentive to what, to listen to the voice of the earth and integrate the dream of the earth, only then will we really be able to bring about transformative change necessary for a viable human presence on the planet. So because of that, whenever I work with a parish, we always begin with a visioning process. So no matter where parishes start, like, oh no, all we need to do is, solve this problem and that problem, and we're off to the races. We always try to frame whatever issues that a parish wants to address within a much bigger visioning process for the project. So, and we always try to ask big questions. What are the aspirations of the project? Where are the other ways, intersections of this project with other things going on in the parish, in your ministries, or in your pastoral landscape, or your charism as a parish, your unique charism, what you offer the world as a parish. All these things become critically important before you embark upon any kind of intervention project with your church. So forgive me, we're just about to be bombed by my cat who loves Zoom meetings. So what are the values that will inform all the decision-making process for this project? They're not just building values, they're values about who we are, how we want the world to see us, how we see ourselves projected out into the world, how we want to collaborate with each other, our outreach, our ministries, how can what we do be reflected and embodied in all of these other parts of who we are as a parish? So, and then of course, to extend an understanding of who you are as a parish to beyond the walls of your church and the metaphoric walls of your congregation to local, regional, and global communities that ultimately we have an impact upon. So the goals of a project can only properly emerge after these fundamental aspirations are defined. And I strongly urge you not to proceed until you have that clear vision. Goals, in fact, can become obstacles, whereas a purpose, an underlying purpose, can be the rudder that helps navigate the process and keep you on course. I can't tell you, even when I was teaching at university, there was nothing more difficult for me as a professor to see how students would veer off track. like they go off down on some tangent that got them so far from the intentions of what they started with that it was impossible to recenter and reorient themselves with what they were trying to do. So I even go to the point where once we have established a charter for the project, we get the leadership of the parish to sign off on it. So almost like a manifesto or a declaration. This is who we are. This is what this project is about. This is what we're trying to achieve. This is how it intersects with who we are as a parish. And then so that remains a constant guide or template for helping you with every subsequent decision. So, you can test every decision down the line against that charter. So I suggest that, the best way to proceed is to think like the planet. And it's 4.5 billion years of self-regulating, self-educating evolution that can be described as cosmogenesis. I remember when I was studying theology, I was invited to do a couple of presentations at the Ontario Association of Architects, very, very first attempt at addressing sustainability. And they called that their Enviro Fest. And I remember presenting a paper entitled The Earth as Primary Architect. And then the next year, I presented a paper, The Earth as Primary Educator. So I profess that everything I need to know as a architect, I can learn from the earth. And I would say that everything that an accountant needs to learn about accounting can ultimately be learned from the earth, or a doctor, or a lawyer, or a judge. So because there's been this incredible creativity in the processes that have brought us to the diversity of life that we find on the planet today. So Tom would also say, and Brian Swim, who's a physicist, who the two of them co-wrote a book called The Universe Story. They say that basically the way in which the universe has evolved over its 14.5 billion years of existence really comes down to three important principles. The first of which is always moving towards greater differentiation or diversity. So if we go all the way back to what the Big Bang, or what he calls great flaring forth at the beginning of time, we start with hydrogen and helium as it gets kind of dispersed out, into the universe. And for 1 billion years, it's out there floating around, and then eventually coalesce into the first generation stars. And then eventually those first generation stars implode or explode and sacrifice themselves to create all the other elements in the periodic table that we know. And it's those elements that form everything that follows, including our own sun, our planet, and the solar systems, and the stars in the sky that scientists can see through their telescopes. The second is subjectivity. Well, actually, I think I've, I do move on to explaining these in the context of tonight's talk. But always working towards greater complexification. So every entity in the universe is a subject and not an object, insofar as each one of us is a unique expression of that 14.5 billion years of cosmogenesis. And it's always worked towards greater complexification, to the point where now, as humans, we are so complex that we have actually been able to become the self-reflective consciousness of the universe. So for the first time, the universe, through the human, is in a unique position to understand how it has evolved, if you will. So that's an incredible synergy that exists between ourselves and the universe. And then, of course, the third one, which everybody will understand if they acknowledge the first two, is that we're all interconnected and bonded in an integral communion and interrelationship. So, if all these billionaires manage to get beyond the gravitational force of the Earth and into interstellar space, with their rocket ships, They won't find aliens out there. What they're going to find are their kin. In other words, we're interrelated with everything in the universe. So what does all of this mean to a conversation about sustainability and climate change and church renovations or greening your church? It has to do with how we approach our decision-making processes. So for example, if we want to think about ensuring that fundamental principle of diversity to be able to continue, we have to consider the impact of our project decisions on diversity or differentiation. So, do my choices diminish diversity by negatively impacting wilderness habitat or human displacement or exploitation or non-renewable resources? Can I source local materials? Can I use local labor to support the local economy? Were they extracted in harmful ways? Or were they extracted in ways that are more benign? Can our project actually promote biophilia or the love of nature by restoring habitat, or be regenerative by creating more resources than the project consumes? These are lofty aspirations, and yet I think it's still important that we use them as a basis for our decision-making processes. Because if we don't bring big picture thinking, we might solve the immediate problem, but we're going to create a lot of others by doing that. Okay. How do our project decisions affect the subjective identity and authenticity at the heart of every being as unique expressions of the divine? Do our choices recognize and give expression to the intrinsic value and not just the instrumental value of a material? So for me as an architect, the only reason why I am creative is because of the creativity that declares itself every day in the natural world around me. I mean, my creativity emerges out of the universe and the earth's creativity. So with every mountain that gets scarred and deforested, with every species extinct, that's a sacred voice that gets silenced, which ultimately negatively impacts my own creativity and my own interiority. So how do our project decisions affect the interconnectedness or communion of all living and non-living entities? Do our choices recognize the interdependencies within the web of life that exist in an unbroken bond? Do our choices negatively impact the integrity of ecosystems within which the materials are extracted, processed, transported, and erected? Most of us probably have no idea where the building materials come from that we use on a day-to-day basis. Whether or not, whether something like aluminum, that we use for all our windows, that the fact that the bauxite might be mined in a sensitive ecosystem that displaces indigenous peoples of the region and contaminates habitats, and then gets shipped halfway across the world to be smelted at huge temperatures, for the creation of the alloys that we then process again further into things like aluminum framing and whatever. So some strategies, if you're considering a renovation or, a complete renewal of the church, or an amalgamation where you tear down a church or consolidate 3 parishes into one and build a new church, can the existing church facility or any portion thereof remain and be renovated and or adapted for other users with shared values? So we all know that congregations, the reality is we know congregations are diminishing. Heritage Trust in Canada anticipate that something like 6,000 to 9,000 places of worship across Canada will be shut down in the next decade. That's a huge number of a huge amount of our sacred and historical legacy and heritage that we don't want to lose. So if we are struggling to financially sustain our churches, are there other users out there? Are there other partners with shared values that can help, that we can rent to or share our space with or renovate our space to accommodate them, in order for us to be able to, or for together collectively to help the financial sustainability of the building, and maybe use some of those resources towards improving the ecological footprint of our buildings. So there, I've just spoke to this issue. Other partners. So, there's an organization run by an Anglican priest out of the Montreal diocese by name of Graham Singh, and he founded an organization called Trinity Centers Foundation, and it started because he was pastor of a parish on St. Catherine Street in Montreal, and he was dealing with dwindling financial resources, lots of things that needed to be fixed in the church. And he had to figure out a way to expand the use of this church, which was essentially only being used on Sunday mornings for worship. Invite in people from the broader community to rent the space and use it. And he had to make some modifications to accommodate that. So this might be an extreme case, but he actually partnered with a circus, like Cirque du Soleil kind of idea. And they removed the pews from the sanctuary, and they refitted, with some, gear on the beams and whatever, so that a circus could perform in there for, the broader community during the week. And then, and there was a curtain drawn across the sanctuary so that the sacredness of the space wouldn't be compromised during those performances. But on Sunday, then they moved the chairs in and they pulled back the curtain, and all of a sudden it was a church again. So, part of how he supports the finances of that church has to do with these partnerships. Now, he has gone on to create this foundation, and he's working with churches all across Canada to help them broker solutions and broker partnerships that help them maintain their spaces for worship, because he too believes in the heritage value of these as worship spaces, but also so that they can become sustainable financially. So I have, we've done over 100 projects for church, for parishes, and I could show you lots of different examples, most of which are probably beyond, the vision of a parish in the Ontario diocese. But I do want to focus in on just one tonight. And again, it's probably beyond the aspiration of most parishes. Nonetheless, I think it provides an example of some conservation strategies, the idea of reusing space, of creating space where space doesn't exist now without actually adding on to the building, and a renovation to ensure the ongoing viability of a collective cultural heritage. So this is Grace Church in Toronto. It's fairly large, as you can see. It dates back to the 1880s, and it was originally a Presbyterian, St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. And the original St. Andrew's was on Adelaide Street. And then at some point, the congregation had a bit of a split. And so half of them went to King Street and to build a new St. Andrew's there. And for those who know Toronto, it's the one across the street from Roy Thompson Hall. And then the other half came up here to Carleton and Jarvis to build this church. And then as that congregation started to diminish, they moved up to Bloor Street in the 1980s and have a church that's at the base of an office tower. And they sold it to an evangelical Lutheran and Latvian community, who then came in and modified it to suit their liturgies. And then eventually, when they didn't need such a grand space anymore, there was another group, Grace Toronto Church, that had been worshiping in an auditorium of a local art school. They were looking for a church, And so happily, the two came together and transferred ownership, so that they could now have a traditional church within the city core, because their ministry was to the poor and the marginalized in the city. So, like most churches of that vintage, it hadn't been well cared for. The basement was a bit of a dungeon, low ceilings. It was mostly just used for storage, and it had very low ceiling. And part of their mandate, they had a very, very, very active congregation, mostly young professionals, many with young children. They had a huge Christian education program, like close to 100 kids every Sunday for Sunday school. And they needed space for them. And the existing church upstairs could not accommodate all of these different uses that they needed. So we came up with the idea of actually excavating the basement and the underpinning to create space. So this space that you see here becomes this space. So this is kind of like a reception area, kind of, process all the kids and get them to the right classrooms, et cetera, et cetera. And here are a series of offices during the week for the parish. And then on Sunday, those same spaces get converted to Christian education classrooms for different age groups. And then all those sliding doors on the right, which is away from the windows, sort of buried deeper into the bowels of the church, become storage for all of these different ministries and activities. And then here's a typical office where we actually drop the window, the basement window, to get more natural light into the space. This was the way you used to get to the washrooms in the basement. And this is the way you do it now. So again, by creating this kind of open, gracious stair to connect upstairs to downstairs, kids were no longer afraid to go downstairs, and the parents weren't afraid or had to send their kids downstairs. So this was the original entrance to the church, the main entrance off Carleton, and very constricted, very tight on the left. And then that led to this door, which was their kind of social hall on the ground floor. And we reorganized the sort of social spaces and the sacred spaces within the church to make really, really clear, like a really clear central lobby and what I would call a narthex, which then gave access to the social spaces on one side and the sacred spaces or worship space on the other. And this is what it looks like. So, these are new doors out onto Carleton. So this becomes a new main entrance of the church. Very transparent. It's very contemporary. You can see the stair that I had a previous image of that leads you down to the basement. The doors on the right go to their main social hall. Behind me, or up a few steps, are the doors into the sanctuary or the worship space. So this old social hall that would have been all carved up becomes this. And this has become their major kind of place in which they engage the broader community. So when they first opened the church, they invited the entire neighborhood to an open house. And they actually had gone around to the neighbors and taken photographs of the neighbors and mounted them in this hall. So these are all people who don't necessarily go to this church, but who are the people that they will be engaging with on a day-to-day basis. And this beautiful hall that respects the cultural heritage, but brings modern, brightness and convenience and support spaces for fellowship events during services or before and after services, but also available to the entire community. So again, they're becoming more invitational and welcoming to engage the broader communities that they serve and beyond the congregations that they serve. So this was the second floor social hall. Because there was a huge balcony, the congregation tended to split, like after service, that the people in the balcony went to the upper hall and the people downstairs went to the lower hall. And this is what the upper hall looks like now. And again, by just kind of pulling away some of the interventions that have been added over the years, we're able to kind of reveal the beauty, the natural beauty of the park next door through the windows, and the architectural details, heritage details of this space. And again, the flexibility with such a large space that it affords. This is the sanctuary and the worship space as it was when we were commissioned, and this is what it looks like now. So again, we made some very minor interventions. For example, like in the sanctuary area, to provide the opportunity for concerts and other potential users to rent the space for a venue. This happens to be a service, but as you can see, they have a huge music ministry, and they introduced really good AV equipment. We kind of introduced new pews and a new heating and air conditioning system to make it more commodious for people, and new AV systems and lighting. But essentially, it's the same heritage space. So from that, to that. And then, so we always try to find the most cost-effective strategies, and interventions that will also be the most sensitive to feature the character-defining heritage elements of an existing historic church property. And sometimes all that means is pulling apart things that have been added over the generations, to hide some damaged plaster or whatever, in order to reveal, what was there originally, that your ancestors experienced when they went to church, and to kind of lovingly restore those. So here's just another example. This is the basement of a church in Guelph that we were commissioned to renovate. And in this basement, what you're looking at is actually a wooden floor on top of dirt. And you're looking at peeling paint and plaster that was throughout this basement, and it just smelled horrible of mold and mildew. And our mandate from the congregation was to patch and paint that plaster to make it look pretty again, right? But our investigations demonstrated that the moisture within those walls was so high that if we did that, within a matter of a couple of years, it would look like this again. So so we took the budget that was allocated for that intervention and did this instead. So what we did was we actually removed the plaster and the paint back to the original rubble stone walls. This building dates back to the 1880s as well. And we created this, this beautiful heritage space that is now used as a chapel, as an ambulatory to display the various statues, historic statues of saints. It's also used for children's liturgy. We introduced, again, ventilation. The whole basement is now air conditioned. We didn't air condition upstairs, but we used geothermal energy to do that, which is the most kind of energy efficient way. Doesn't use any fossil fuels to to cool and heat this basement. So just to say that we really need to rethink every aspect of our day-to-day operations for ways to reduce your environmental footprint, from everything from plastic use to waste management. So these are just like some strategies that even if you're not even contemplating a renovation, like if you can just, and I'm probably preaching to the converted, so forgive me if you're not learning anything you already know. But I mean, there's really, if you look at every aspect of that day-to-day operation, I'm sure you will find ways and challenge with the way you do things. Oh, well, we have to have paper cups and styrofoam cups because, it's easier and we don't want to have to wash dishes and whatever. But I mean, if you really, really think about it in terms of those big picture kind of framework that we discussed earlier, maybe it'll help you decide to do things differently. So when it comes to the actual building, one of the most effective things you can do, and it's not very expensive, is to start improving the weather tightness of the building by sealing air leakage. And you do that by caulking around windows, by putting proper weather stripping on your doors, to kind of make sure that all that heat you're generating isn't just going, you're not heating the neighborhoods around you, right? And then when it comes time, when your heating system begins to get near the end of its expected service life, and let me say that most heating systems have probably a 20-year lifespan. You can count on 20 years. If you get 20 years, you're lucky. If you get 30 years, you're really, really lucky. So and undoubtedly, probably many of the heating systems in the churches that you're in now are getting near the end of that service life. So when you go to replace it, make sure that you invest in the most energy efficient replacement that is available. So for example, when I replaced when I first moved into my 1867 house here in Toronto, it had an oil furnace. And I eventually replaced it with, at the time, the most energy efficient gas furnace. And then it lasted 23 years. And then I just replaced it a few years ago with, again, an even more energy efficient furnace that's also operated with, it's got a variable speed fan. It's got a smart sensor that kind of ramps up additional heat when it's needed and ramps it down when I don't need it. Even so the thermostat is a really sophisticated thermostat, and it's got DC motors, which use a lot less power than an AC motor. So, all of these things need to be considered. So if you're really lucky and you can afford, going beyond that, then again, I would suggest that you use the most energy efficient mechanical systems available with zero carbon emissions where possible, such as geothermal or heat pumps with energy recovery units and displacement ventilation. So most of our early churches that were built got all their ventilation from opening windows, right? And that's maybe okay in the shoulder seasons, but doesn't work very well on a hot, humid day in the summer or on a really, really cold day in the wintertime. So for the most part, most churches don't have any effective ventilation. So now current codes recognize that, and they say that, okay, if you're going to make improvements to your church, certain improvements, that will trigger the need for an upgrade for a ventilation system that basically takes the air within the church, extracts it, and uses whatever latent heat or cooling that's in that air to preheat or pre-cool fresh air ventilation coming in so that you don't fall asleep during the homily. Anyway, so that is a very energy efficient way of reducing your energy costs. So, and then I would also say that where possible, consider how the building decisions can also serve as a form of catechesis or form of, in a way, its own ministry. So I've been attending this heritage conference and the last few days, and I've come to the conclusion that maybe one of the most effective ministries that you can possibly engage in is to improve the energy efficiency of your church. I mean, in terms of the value that that's going to bring to yourselves as a congregation and to the greater community in mitigating and doing your bit to mitigate climate change, may have the most positive impact of any other outreach or ministry that you do, particularly if you can demonstrate that to your neighbors. So some potential resources, Mary, I'm sure I'm running out of time, right? So this will all be in the video, and I'm happy to leave this with you. But here are some sort of the eco-theological resources that you might want to look for, some big picture kind of background on what to do. And then here are some other potential resources that you may or may not be already familiar with. There's something called the Green Churches Network. And right now they have a whole introduction to energy efficiency in church projects. And if you go to that website, you can connect to that and they can help you and tell you what grants are available, what other incentives are available for improving your energy efficiency. There's an organization called earthday.org. Of course, it's the Global Catholic Climate Movement. Something called Faith in the Common Good, to which I've been an advisory, Greening Sacred Spaces. They will actually come in and do an audit, an energy audit on your building, so that to give you the tools you need to actually, improve its energy efficiency. There's somebody by the name of Norman Levesque who has created all sorts of free and reasonable courses, reasonably priced courses that you can take to help kind of introduce this idea of creation care and sustainability into your parish and how to green your church. And of course, there's also the Archdiocese of Toronto's Bishop Asbill's Committee on Care for Creation, which has a web presence. And I'm going to now take you to some takeaways and then to very quickly to some PDFs with actual things that you can use in future. So the first is that remember that building is a worldview activity. Sustainability is integral to the project and not just an accessory consideration. That we should not proceed without a clear purpose, cultivated through a fulsome visioning process, and wherever possible, retain the services of experts, whether they're engineers or architects or heritage consultants. They are your best investment. So thank you for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then bring up very quickly a PDF file with some other resources if you wish, or I can just send that to you, Mary, and we can open it up for questions.
Well, let's see. I think what we should do is we should use that as a resource, and we can have that.
Okay.
Because people will definitely be interested in that. And I think we should, just because of time and being respectful of others' time, we should just turn it over for questions. I'm wondering if there's any questions from the participants on the call.
So first of all, let me apologize for going on and on, but you can tell I'm passionate about this stuff. It's really, I really think it's important.
Not at all. I actually found it very fascinating. I was actually quite inspired by the photos that you've taken of some of those projects. And I think it actually, puts a fire under us to do even the little things that will make a difference. So I'll open up the floor. Are there any questions?
I'm not sure if you can see me.
Mary, you're good.
Okay, I can't see anybody else. Anyway, I'm
Oh,
wondering.
I'll stop sharing, okay, and then you'll be able.
That might help.
Okay, there you go.
Oh, there we are. Okay, I'm wondering. You mentioned, I think it was Greening Sacred Spaces, that they would come and do an audit.
Yes.
Will they come all the way here?
That's a good question. They've been trying to branch out to other jurisdictions. I believe they had some parishes in Kingston that they did some audits. So they were able to secure some grant money from the government to do this. And the last time I spoke to the principals there, they were looking for parishes, trying to get beyond the GTA. So
are you referring to Faith in the Common Good?
yes.
Yes,
sorry.
okay. Stephen Collette of Faith in the Common Good was
Right.
involved in our first webinar back in March.
Okay.
He was on our conference call at that time. And I recall, unfortunately, that one was the first one and it didn't get recorded. So we had to do it over again later. And Stephen was not on the second conference call. So but he mentioned in response to Ian Kilbourne's presentation, Ian Kilbourne is an energy auditor that we employed here at St. Luke's Camden East to do an energy audit here. And Stephen Collette was very thankful for Ian Kilbourne's presentation, he actually said what you're doing, Ian, is more in depth and detailed than anything that we do.
Yeah.
He seemed to indicate that much of what their work was showing, giving congregations the information through which they could do much of the work themselves.
Right. In fact, Father Ian, I do on my PDF that I was going to show, I do have a kind of a checklist from Greening Sacred Spaces that people can use, as a template to kind of begin to explore some of the ways in which they can green their church.
That sounds great. Yeah.
So are you going to send the PDF so that we can have access to it? Since it is
Yes,
not part of this.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Yeah. I'll
Ian,
send that to Mary and Dawn. Is that okay? Because that's
Yeah,
my
sure.
point of
Yeah.
contact.
Yeah, we can circulate it.
Okay.
Have
And
you
it's a number
worked
of
with,
things, including, some of the things that we prepared under Bishop Asbill's Care for Creation. So, for example, I wrote a little piece on, creating outdoor sacred space. We also had a Lenten fast, which kind of spoke to the way in which we relate to creation. We had a number of we have something on plastic use, reducing plastic use. We have, there's also other checklists, which is why I didn't want to go through that because, you're quite capable of following those on your own. I will send all of that.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Mhm.
I think one of the things that I certainly took away from at the end of your talk was that we need to rethink the ways to reduce our environmental footprint. I think that's the key to all of this discussion. Some of those concepts are so much more complex than others, but some of them are so easy for us to hit the mark on, which the weather tightness of a building and replacing outdated heating systems. Your two last recommendations were, I think,
And lighting would be another one, right? A lot of
Right.
old churches have, 500-watt incandescent bulbs in their, pendant lights, and you can now do this, create the same amount of lumens with something that's probably 10 to 15 watts, and
Right.
those kind of things are no-brainers, and they're inexpensive to do. And in fact, there are even some incentive programs in some jurisdictions that would even pay for it, So, the thing that I do want to say, and I don't want to discourage you from doing those types of things, but I think that most of the sustainability conversation is around making small incremental changes that allow us to indefinitely defer the transformational change necessary to bring about a viable human presence. And so I'm working very hard to kind of either, whether it's through eco-theology or, net zero or, even heritage, to try to bring about that transformational change. Because we're not going to get it
Yeah.
in any way.
yeah.
have you worked with churches in the country, rural
Yes. Yeah.
churches?
Yes.
And do you have some observations to make about that? For example, in our case, we heat with electric heaters that are pre-programmed to warm up for the services, but otherwise are just at minimum temperatures for
So the
to
building
maintain-
doesn't freeze, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the water doesn't freeze.
Yeah. Now, interestingly, you're probably thinking, wow, that's a really expensive way to heat, right?
No, we
Joseph?
are not.
Oh,
But
good,
I'm wondering-
because that is incredibly environmentally friendly to do it that way.
Yes,
So
yes.
in fact, the city of Toronto has just adopted a strategy and a policy that by the year 2050, there will be no more fossil fuels burned in this city to heat buildings.
Yeah.
So you're already way ahead of everybody. And if you're also investing in Bullfrog Power, I don't know if it's available out there, but then I think you're already making a huge impact to reduce your ecological footprint.
Mhm.
You know, I built myself, I think some of you know that I also have a country place in Northumberland County. And it's a straw bale, off the grid house, process all our own black water waste to you know, pure water coming out. And we just today got hydro connected. And so, and you might think, wow, that's really disappointing. And after the initial shock of knowing that we could no longer sustain these off-grid systems because they got wiped out for the 5th time by lightning and totally fried, the amount of embodied energy that went into producing all that equipment and maintaining it over the 15 years that we were off-grid was probably more intensive than if we had been connected to hydro and buying bullfrog power for those 15 years. Do you understand what I mean? So we really, really need to think about this stuff, right?
Life
But
cycle.
for rural churches, do you have some observations or some things that we should consider or think about from the projects you have done or from your own observations?
Well, you know, I don't think we have time this evening to kind of go into all the possibilities because every single church is unique. Right? Every single church has its own, you know, program, like, you know, when you use the church and different strategies depending on, you know, kind of a site visit to the church to see what's working and what isn't working. I mean, you know, I'm a firm believer that our buildings tell us what they need. You know, they really need to be part of the conversation. It's not so much what we bring, but what the building tells us it needs. So I would certainly encourage you to engage the services of a local expert, you know, or someone like myself to come out and you know, talk to you and visit and see for themselves what needs to be done.
We had at our church, Ian Kilborn give us an energy audit, and his recommendation was that we purchase some cold climate heat pumps, which would enable us to get completely or at least mostly away from the use of fossil fuels. As currently the church here uses oil, furnace oil, and I've wanted to get rid of that for a long time, ever since I came here. So we're working on that, and we hope to engage the services of a company to install a cold climate heat pump by the time the snow flies, hopefully, so that at least half, if not three quarters of our heating energy will come from a cold climate heat pump, and that's far more efficient. And eventually also will save us a considerable amount of money as compared to what we have been spending on furnace oil over the years.
Yeah, that's great news, Father. You know, and that technology is improving all the time.
It is.
Because I think there's such a demand for it that I think, you know, I think as consumers, you know, we need to drive the manufacturing industry and the design industry. You know, we have incredible power to demand that kind of stuff, you know, as opposed to waiting for them to figure it out. You know, markets tend to drive things. Now, you know, my understanding, and again, I think the cold climate heat pump will serve you probably 95% of the time. There may be, if there's an extended period of minus 20 degrees out, you know, you might need to have a little bit of supplementary heat. Again, depending on how comfortable you want to be, you know, like we keep our furnace at a fairly low temperature during the winter, and we put on sweaters, you know. We're not like the people walk around in the wintertime in their house with t-shirts because and have it cranked up to 75, 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're quite, you know,
You can use your cat to keep you warm.
That's right. In fact, they are very good at keeping us warm and us keeping them warm.
That's right. That's right.
Especially at night.
Well, yeah. Well, I think that is a very nice light note to end on.
Okay.
Thank
Say
you
hi, Dante.
Hello.
Sometimes
Lovely.
Yeah, he loves
Thank
Zoom.
you so much. That was a very, very interesting discussion, very thoughtful. Your work that you've done is quite impressive, and those are some beautiful spaces. And the fact that they're beautiful and more efficient and more appropriate for use is quite an accomplishment. And we hope to all sort of look at those things and consider that for our respective churches. And I'm sure that other people in the lay people, the property people will be, jumping on, and we'll be encouraging them to watch this as it's up on YouTube. So
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I do want to say that hopefully I brought to this kind of, theological perspective for everything that you're already doing. And I'm impressed if Father Ian is looking at, winter heat pumps and, you guys are already doing, all sorts of other initiatives, then you should feel very proud of yourselves that you are engaged in this conversation, and we just need to ramp it up.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
I really appreciated your eco-theology. It really resonated with me, and I think you're right that the planetary problem is a spiritual issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual crisis. It's not, if it,
But it strikes me that we don't hear enough about eco-theology from the pulpit, and we should. We do during the season of creation, but that's as far as it goes. In fact, I have not before heard about you started the presentation with talking about the biblical perspective and as almost as opposed to eco-theology perspective. And I think that's certainly environmentally consistent way to look at the earth and at creation and at the humans in as part of the universe.
Mhm.
But a lot of, I think, at least in my experience, a lot of the interpretation of the creation comes through the scripture, which is the first part or the first viewpoint that you referred to.
Yeah. Now, having said that, like I know a lot of scripture scholars and some of my own research, like we've misinterpreted the Bible. I think there's some very, very important passages in the Bible that speak to this. So let me give you a really simple example. When the Noah's Ark story, right? At the end, when the flood waters receded and Noah stepped off that ark, when God spoke to him, he said that the covenant was not just with he and his family, but with every creature that was on that boat. So in other words, he promised that he would not flood the earth again and cause, mass extinction. So
yeah.
If we're participating in that extinction, then we're breaking our covenant with God.
And the covenant with the creatures that first hinted at in Noah is also mentioned in the prophet Hosea, a covenant with the creatures. So it's like there is a continuing theme throughout the Old Testament of a covenant with the creatures that even theologians who are engaged in what's called covenant theology don't tend to list that covenant with the creatures in the list of covenants that God made with people. To me, it's just emblematic of how little attention has been paid to what the scriptures actually say.
Mm-hmm. And if you read Laudato Si again, Francis would say that again we misunderstood or misinterpreted what it meant to till the earth. To till the, it's about caring for it, not exploiting it. So and because today is Truth and Reconciliation, think about it. An indigenous cosmology would never have allowed the Western scientific reductionists way of seeing the earth emerge. I
Mhm.
mean, because you wouldn't treat your mother that way,
Mm.
I mean, their relationship to the land was so much more benign and respectful than us settlers, I mean, for thousands and thousands of years, the old growth forests were not cut down, or the animals were only were respected for their gift of life, so that the humans could live. And there was usually a ritual or ceremony every time an animal was killed, to acknowledge that and to accept and to thank the animal for giving up its life for us. And what do? We have factory farms now. We don't even know where our food comes from, right?
Yeah.
So we have a lot to learn from.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any final words?
Thank you.
Yes, Roberta, that was fascinating,
My
very
pleasure.
interesting. And yes, it was wonderful. Thank you. So I
And
hope
thank
everybody had,
you. Thank you
Thank
for
you very
inviting
much,
me.
Roberto.
Thank you for attending and for propagating whatever it is that we talked about tonight for others through the YouTube channel, and for all your speakers. I really enjoyed last week. I think political agency is really important, as constituents. So we step up and do, and because that's how change happens.
Yes,
yes,
indeed.
this series has been quite amazing, talking about agency, talking about climate justice. That was one of our sessions. And, going back to Bill Morrow, our first session was about what we were just talking about, how the, scriptures have been taken out of context potentially. So with that said, we have our sixth in the series, which is the Right Reverend Michael Olton. And he will be talking next Thursday, October 7th, on The Earth is the Lord's and the Fullness Thereof. So please join us next Thursday for the final session in our series. And thank you, everybody, for attending, and good evening. Thank you,
Thank
Roberto.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good night,
Good night,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.